My name is Crystal Jamison Woods, and I'm a labor employment partner at DLA Piper.
And I'm Lisa Sotelo, a founder and partner at Sotelo Immigration Law Group. And we are so honored to be here today with DBA We Lead to have a conversation with our own very living legend, Judge Barbara Lynn of the Northern District of Texas. Thank you for joining us.
Delighted.
Yes, thank you. Now, Judge Lynn, you really need no introduction, and so I'll make it quick, but suffice to say, you are a true trailblazer of the legal profession and have shattered gender barriers throughout your career. The laundry list of firsts for women that you've accomplished is remarkable. You were one of the first female members of the co-ed class at University of Virginia, even though someone told you that you weren't even eligible to apply because you were female. You went on to be the first member of the Jefferson Literary and Debate Society, a nearly 200-year-old organization featuring prominent members like Edgar Allan Poe and Woodrow Wilson.
Yes.
Woodrow Wilson. So tell us a little bit about what motivated you not only to set such lofty goals, but to have the gumption to carry them through.
Well, I just had things I wanted to do. I didn't always know that there was going to be a barrier in the way, but sometimes there was, and I learned I just had to kick it over. When I applied to the University of Virginia, as you suggested, I didn't even know that it hadn't been co-ed. I applied because I sort of drew a line where my parents could afford for me to go to school, and that was as far north as I could go, growing up in Miami. And then I found out it was the first year they were accepting women, and that sounded like pretty good odds to me, since there were a lot more men than there were women. And it was a wonderful academic institution, so it just had what I wanted. And when I was accepted there, I didn't realize that they did not require the clubs and organizations to co-educate. And so when I got there, women wanted to be in certain clubs that would not admit them. And that was my situation for the Jefferson Society. And I just persisted and eventually was admitted after some struggles to get there. I was dating my now husband, who was an officer, and he took me as a guest, and I was permitted to speak as a guest. So I was a regular attendee, but I couldn't join until a brilliant parliamentary maneuver that my husband was responsible for.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the membership was split about 50-50 on whether to co-educate. And it took 2/3 to change the bylaws, which would allow only men to be admitted. My husband was the vice president. Many of the most conservative members went off to Mardi Gras. He was the acting president while they were gone. He did a quorum count, figured he had the votes, called a special meeting, and by one vote, they voted to co-educate the Jefferson Society. And when the more conservative members came back, to say they were unhappy would be a great understatement, but the die was cast. So that's how I got in. But between the time I arrived at the university and the time I was admitted, I made them interview me every semester. They had to interview all people who expressed interest, including women, although the bylaws didn't say that. So I made them interview me every semester. And to say that some of them tried to convince me not to come back by being very rude and crude during these interviews, that would also be an understatement, but I didn't let it deter me. I'd show up the next semester and they'd ask me an offensive question and I'd say, "Is that the best you've got? Because last semester's questions were much worse than these." So anyway, I just kept it up and eventually got in and had a wonderful experience being a member of the last part of my college career.
That's amazing. I'm sure there are many members that have since come that greatly appreciate your efforts. And I did want to ask about, I knew that you had met Mike Lynn, who you've now been married to for almost 50 years, is that correct?
48 years,
okay.
Yes.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Y'all are truly a legal powerhouse couple, probably the legal powerhouse couple of Dallas. And I know you also have 2 daughters as well as 3 grandchildren,
Yes.
including a very new addition.
Yes.
So first off, congratulations on that as well.
Thank you so much.
Secondly, as a mother, let us in on your secret. How did you balance such a fantastic legal career with your family life?
Well, it's like breathing. If you think too much about it, you start hyperventilating. So I tried not to obsess on how busy I was all the time. I tried not to be really hard on myself in every part of my life at the same time. You know, there were days when I tried not to go below a C when I scored myself as a mom. C. I tried not to remain at C, but there were some C days. There might have been a D day, but I tried to be about a B mom most of the time. And I hoped I'd be an A, but I couldn't do it every day. And it was the same about being a lawyer. There were days, I remember going to Jim Coleman after I had my second child and saying, Jim, whatever the firm is charging for my time, it's too much. Because I just, I'm stretched, I can't concentrate sometimes, and the firm was very understanding. But there were days when, my husband would take over and I would take over for him. We had a genuine partnership. I had a lot of help. My parents lived here for most of my children's growing up. They helped. I had a lot of friends. We helped each other. And it was just do the best you can in every quadrant of your life. And you had to make some sacrifices and get some help. I was never afraid to ask for help when I needed it.
Yeah. And for someone who's always excelled, I know that's got to be hard to say,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I'm going to accept that today is going to be a B day.
Yeah,
I'm going to get a B today.
You couldn't be an A plus every day and everything.
Yes.
It's just
Yeah.
impossible.
Well, that's remarkable. So I know you went on to attend law school at SMU Debnant School of Law, which is my alma mater as well. But when you attended, it was only about 10% females.
I think it went up to about 15%, but it wasn't
Okay.
a very big number. It was a pretty small number, and the women just excelled in my class. There were 5 women in the top 10 in my class, including number 1 and number 2. So women did very well, and there were women who came right out of college like I did. There were women who went back after they had children. There were women who had children while they were in law school. It was every variety of experience, and I think the women were very supportive of each other. I mean, we expected that we were going to be welcomed with open arms in the legal community at that time, and it just wasn't true.
No, and you mentioned number 1 and number 2 in the class were females. Number 1 was you,
Yes,
correct?
that's right.
Okay, and when you graduated as number 1 in your class, you imagine you'd have all these opportunities open, but at the time, the large law firms weren't hiring any women.
Well, I was very fortunate. I went to the firm that I wanted to go to, which was 𝐏𝐥𝐞𝐚. I worked there after my first year and half the summer after my second year. And it wasn't true for all law firms, but there were a number of law firms, large law firms and medium-sized law firms that just were not interested in hiring women. That wasn't their culture. They never had any women. They didn't think their culture could survive having women. It was going to change their culture to the detriment. I mean, obviously that turned out not to be the case, but we were surprised. We did not anticipate that we were going to have the trouble we had, given how well we had achieved in law school. So that was disillusioning, but we banded together. We formed the Association of Women Law Students, which was the plaintiff in litigation that we filed against 5 Dallas law firms. And I have to say, looking back then, I did not see myself being a federal judge in Dallas. I didn't think that was what was going to come of my involvement in the lawsuits. I mean, we were all very nervous about what we were doing for our careers and whether we were helping women to come rather than ourselves. We recognized that was a possibility, that we were doing irreparable damage to our own careers, although we were paving the way for others. We wanted to pave the way for others and not do irreparable damage to our own careers.
Being one of the first group of women to go to law school and be a lawyer in a law firm, do you see any parallels like in modern day times and with not necessarily the law, because I think we have a lot of women lawyers now and you see a lot of female faces in the courtroom, but do you see any parallels?
Well, I think all professions have experienced the same kind of thing. I mean, accounting was a man's activity. Medicine was a man's activity. One of my daughters is a physician, and my younger daughter works in high tech, and both of them experienced similar kinds of things to what I experienced in the law when I started. So I think barriers are falling in all kinds of different fields, and there are parallels in all of them to what our experience was. Just something unusual. Institutions are slow to change, and they don't like change very much.
Right. And generational, right? Like
Yeah.
every generation seems to have its own battle. It's just remarkable to me to see these battles play out in our own lifetime, our lifetime, and then see people that, we can our own parents and siblings go through these things that are so revolutionary and life-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember one of my daughters said to me one time, how did you put up with it?
Right.
And
How did you?
at the time that I was going through it, even when my kids were little, they didn't really understand that, but they've figured out the way to maneuver around it. So I think women who move into areas that traditionally have been a man's business, they've encountered challenges.
So that was obviously a huge honor to be. You were the first female summer associate and first female associate at 𝐏𝐥𝐞𝐚, and one of the first female associates at a large firm. Obviously, it's a huge honor, but it comes with a lot of responsibility. What was that like?
Well, there were a few women in large firms. Harriet Myers, I'll mention in particular. Linda Wertheimer, now Hart, was a corporate partner, extremely well regarded, as was Harriet. Louise Raggio was practicing, Adelpha Callejo was practicing, really on their own or in small firms. So there were some role models, but in big firms in litigation practice in particular, there were really just a handful of people. So we had to make our own way. I mean, in my law firm, 𝐏𝐥𝐞𝐚 Coleman, they were extremely supportive. I really never had a day where I questioned their commitment to me and to other women who came to the firm. I remember Jim Coleman, who passed away in February of last year. We had a client one time who said to Jim, "I don't want any women working on my files." And Jim said in his deep Georgia Southern accent, "That's fine, just come get your file." And I had that kind of support throughout my career. There were times that clients just were not amenable to the new world as we were developing it, and the firm just would not put up with it.
That's amazing. I can't imagine there was really no one available to be a female mentor, but it seems like you had a lot of mentors.
I
still in
did,
your career.
exactly. I had to look for mentorship from my colleagues who were men, and I got it too. I mean, Jim Coleman, just to tell another story about Jim, when we filed these lawsuits, one of them went to trial, and I wasn't hiding it from the firm, but I hadn't talked about my involvement in the case. And Jim came into my office one morning and he said, "I heard you're going to testify as a witness." I didn't even know how he knew about it, but he knew everything. And he asked me if I wanted him to come down with me for my testimony. And so he walked me down to the courthouse, and then he took me around and introduced me to all the defendants' lawyers and representatives of the firm that were there. And they already knew me because they had taken my deposition, but made it clear to them by what he said and how he said it that I was one of his lawyers at his law firm and should be treated so. And may he rest in peace, Bob Gwynn, who represented the law firm that went to trial, he gave me my first significant bar-related job. I think he made me either a member or the vice chair of the Judiciary Committee of the Dallas Bar, which was the start of my career as a bar junkie. And that's how I met Bob, when he was the adverse lawyer, and he was a great trial lawyer. So that's an irony that Bob, he never took it personally that I was the plaintiff, sort of the plaintiff, the association was the plaintiff, but that I was involved in a piece of litigation where he was the adverse lawyer. That was never a personal matter between me and him.
You never know what relationships are going to turn into.
That's good for people to remember. Don't make enemies when you don't have to.
Right.
They may turn out to be your friends and supporters at the other end.
And how have those mentorship opportunities that you had impacted your career and how you interact with younger lawyers?
I think the most significant thing that I have done in my career is to be a good mentor to a whole lot of people. I was thinking the other day, how many people, if I made a list of people that I had actually mentored in a significant way, it would be in the hundreds. I mean, I have considered that a responsibility of my career to do that. I've always enjoyed having people in the summer who work in my chambers, did the same when I was a lawyer, follow up with people in the Bar Association. I've just taken a lot of people under my wing, and I've had continuing lifelong relationships with many of them. So it's really been a joy. I think it's a very important responsibility.
So before moving on to the judiciary, you became the first female partner at 𝐏𝐥𝐞𝐚.
Right.
Another huge shoes to fill. And then later became a member of the executive committee. What is one piece of advice you would give for younger attorneys and not so young like myself on making a successful career at a law firm?
I always tell young lawyers that if you want something, ask for it. People are so sheepish about making requests for something. The worst thing that can happen is that someone will say no, and you're no worse off than you were before you asked. So I asked for a lot of opportunities as a young lawyer who wanted to do trial work, and I got opportunities because I asked for them. So I think it's a very important thing to let people know what you want. There may be something you want in terms of how you present your case that the judge has never done before. That doesn't mean the judge will never do it. You just have to be convincing, and that's what advocacy is all about. So I think it's important to ask for what you want and to associate yourself with people who will have your back.
And you've kind of modeled that your whole life, starting from scratch, going to law school and fighting for a job in the legal field.
I always felt like you had to manifest courage. That you were, if you were shy and wouldn't tout your own talents and abilities, that you just were not going to accomplish as much as you could. Of course you want to be humble too, but it's a bit of a sales job on yourself, and why it's good for somebody to back you and put their own contacts and assets at play for you. And I'll give you an example of that. So my husband was a young lawyer at 𝐏𝐥𝐞𝐚, and Jack Hauer was the senior lawyer there, and Jim Coleman was the senior lawyer at my firm, and Jack and Jim used to practice law together, and they were both great trial lawyers. And so we were young lawyers, and we invited them over for dinner. And at that time, I was cooking. There was about a 40-year gap between then and when I started cooking again, which was the pandemic. So we invited Jim and Jack for dinner, and their wives. And really the only thing we had to be sure of was that we had enough liquor. We had a nice dinner, and then we just wound them up and let them talk. And it was terrific. And people couldn't believe we had the gumption to invite the senior partners over to dinner, and they were delighted to be invited. Nobody had ever asked them.
For young lawyers especially, I think there is that fear of, first of all, you're a little intimidated. I mean, just look at all the accomplishments of somebody like yourself, right? And then you don't want to ask something silly, but at the same time, it's an opportunity for you to learn from all the experiences that you've had and the mistakes. And I always tell my kids, better to learn from me than have to make your own.
Right. Well, I'll give another example. So my husband's firm had their holiday party last weekend, and one of the associates who they can't appear before me except to be sworn into the bar. So they all come down for me to do that so I can meet them. And he is Greek and Cuban, and I love Greek and Cuban food. So he and his wife, they came up to us. They said, "Oh, we want to have you over for dinner." And I was like, "Yes," and it's sort of the same thing. Good, exercise some initiative. I'd be delighted to come over.
Yeah.
Did you get Greek and Cuban food?
I haven't. We're setting it up after the holidays.
Well, going back, I guess transitioning from a successful career in private practice, what motivated you to want to be a judge? How did that come about?
Well, I really hadn't thought about it until the election of 1992. And I was a soft Democrat. I wasn't very active in politics, but when Bill Clinton was elected, I thought, well, maybe I would have a shot at becoming a federal judge. So I talked to people in my firm, and Jim Coleman was very encouraging, but not thrilled about the prospect that I would leave the firm, of course. And this was also at about the time that my husband was starting his own law firm. So I decided to apply. And you have to go through a process. You fill out all these forms, and then the senators have a committee, and you get interviewed by several different groups of people, and I didn't get it. It took a while for that vacancy to be filled. Eventually, my friend and colleague Sam Lindsay filled that role, and I never really gave it any more serious thought. So that was 1993. So 5 years later, I got a call from a person that I had known well, Martin Frost, who had been my congressman, And he used to practice law at my firm, but had left before I started. So I knew him several different ways. There was another nominee for the position who, unbeknownst to me, was going to withdraw because his nomination had not moved. And Martin wanted to suggest me to the president. And I just hadn't thought about it in 5 years, and I was moving up the ladder in my firm, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. Times had changed, but I thought about it for 2 weeks. Congressman Frost was calling my office every day. And finally I decided to do it. It took about a year, but the timing was much better because my husband had his firm going then for about 5 years. I have accused him of sabotaging my original nomination, that maybe he was writing anonymous letters to the Senate Judiciary Committee about me, I don't know, but the timing was much better. And it took about a year, and I got a lot of help, particularly from Congressman Frost and Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison. She and I knew each other well. She's my friend today. She gave me great advice and support during my nomination. And it was a stressful time for me because I'm type A, A+, AAA. And so during the year that my nomination was pending, I got on the Senate Judiciary website maybe 15 times a day to watch myself not moving. And they had 50,000 hits in a year, and I'm sure I accounted for 40,000 of them. I mean, I just found it so frustrating that my fortunes would wax and wane because of wheat prices in the Midwest. There was really no connection between what was happening and not happening and me. And meanwhile, I'm still practicing law, and I'm trying to keep up a practice and get new clients who wanted to know if I was actually going to be their lawyer at the time of a trial. So it was all very challenging. But it's like having a baby, and you all know this. After it's over, you don't remember the pain.
What did it feel like when you first started? What was that? Was it like changing your hat?
So I'll tell you a funny story. So I thought, well, I'm going to be good at it, and I'm going to know how to do it because I've been practicing law for a long time, and I've watched it. And lawyers always think they can do it better than the judge. It's harder than it looks, I'll say that. So I had a hearing early on in my career on the bench, maybe a month. Very sophisticated, excellent lawyers, very good argument. So 4 lawyers. So the first lawyer, I'm listening, I don't say anything. Second lawyer, I ask a question, and the lawyer says, "Judge, I worked on this case for almost a year before I figured out that's the key to the case." And I'm thinking to myself, good job, Bill Clinton. And then third lawyer, I make some comment. He says, "I think I should just stop arguing because you've obviously got such a good handle on it." And then the fourth lawyer, the same kind of thing happened. So I said to the first lawyer, "In the interest of fairness, I'm going to give you 15 seconds for some shameless sucking up right now." And he said, "You really look good today, Judge." And I said, "Okay, just for the future, that's the winner right there, lawyer number 1. So it's a kick. The lawyers are very deferential, sometimes excessively deferential. My jokes are funny all the time, even when they're not. I said to my husband, I don't really have to go to the gym because I look good every day. You have to recognize that a lot of this is exaggerated, but it's very challenging, interesting. It doesn't get repetitive. The criminal docket is hard. It's been hard for almost 22 years now, but it's a very interesting job with a lot of challenges. And I have new people in my office because I have law clerks, and I've had my same judicial assistant for almost my whole career on the bench. And it's just a good job. Now, the chief job that I've had for 5.5 years now, that's a different kind of job that I have to do on top of my regular job. And it's got a lot of administrative challenges to it. But having been on the bench for as long as I had been, it was an interesting challenge to take on.
If it seems like there's a lot happening in the courtroom, right? There's a lot that you see. And I've heard you refer to magic happening in the court. You've got the charisma of the performances from the lawyers, and you've got the stories, and you've got the trauma, and then you've got the deliberators. Can you tell me what does that feel like?
So there's nothing I like better than to see great lawyers in court. I mean, that's the joy of being a judge. And I love it when I'm having a great argument where I'm asking tough questions and they're taking me on, and it's really a great exchange. So that's wonderful. And great lawyers can and do make the difference every day in the outcome of matters. If people say it's just the facts and the law and it doesn't matter who the vehicle is, that's just not true. But what I really think is magic is what happens in the jury room. I mean, a lot of people think, particularly when I talk to people from other countries who don't have a jury system, they are incredulous that we trust these critical decisions to people, many of whom haven't even been to college. And we throw them in a room with people they don't know, many of whom they would never hang out with at all. They have very little in common, and they're trapped in this room to make critically important decisions. And it is in fact magic what happens. They do the right thing. They work very hard. They put their biases and their prejudices aside. They develop great respect for each other. And if they're treated right, and that's in my top 5 goals, is to make sure they are treated right by me and by our system, then they respect the system, and hopefully they are emissaries for our system out in the world. Our system of justice certainly has its shortcomings. It makes mistakes, it's not always correct, it's not always free of bias and prejudice, but as far as I know, it's the best system there is in the world. And we should always work very hard to improve it and make it as close to perfection as we can achieve. But to do that, we need emissaries. And people who have been on a jury and have seen how that process works and how critical their role is, much more important than mine in a trial, that's how we can get that job done. So I love our system. I love jury trials, and people who think we should get rid of them, I just disagree up one side and down the other. It's a beautiful, beautiful system.
So every day in the life of a judge has got to have some excitement and be very interesting, but are there things about private practice that you really miss?
So when I became a lawyer, I wanted to do litigation, and I was trained by great lawyers at Carrington. I was first assigned to Bob Mao, who was just a fantastic, fantastic lawyer. And I worked with Jim Coleman, and I worked with Fletcher Yarborough, and all of them were at the top of their game. So I was just very happy in my practice. Jim in particular would transition clients to the people that worked with him with no problem. And you know, eventually Jim's hope was that the client would forget that they came there because of him. And there was never any problem with stealing your client. He wanted that to happen. So I had great responsibility. I loved working with other lawyers on teams. I mean, most of the associates that work for me are among my very closest friends. So I just came from lunch at Neiman's for the annual holiday lunch, and every single person that was there, except my mother, was one of my associates at one time. And they're all off doing different things, everyone. But I love training associates. I didn't really like working with first-year associates because they asked not really good questions. But I liked having people that had a couple of years of experience and training them. And now I do that with my law clerks. So standing up, making a good argument before a really good, challenging judge, that was terrific. And working with my partners was fun, just wonderful intellectual exercise. I mean, it was really the best of jobs that you could have until you become a judge, and then you have the best job, because not only do you get exposure to great lawyers, but you get to initiate the exchange and guide the argument and write an opinion. And I do also have an opportunity now as a judge that I really didn't have as a lawyer, and that is to handle appellate matters because, gosh, I think about 15 years ago I got invited to sit with the Ninth Circuit as a visiting judge, and I've done that regularly for about 15 years. So I never did any appellate work really as a lawyer, just a handful of matters. So I miss the actual standing up and doing it, and I do say to my law clerks every now and then, come in my office, I'm going to reenact what just happened as if I were doing it. Because I miss getting in the middle of the fray. So in a non-jury case, I'm all over it. I'm asking questions left and right. In a jury case, I try really hard to be pretty invisible because I don't like to get in the way of the lawyers. But in a non-jury case, I can vent my desire to be more active in it because I really miss that, being the advocate. That's super fun. My husband, when I became a judge, he asked me, why would you want to be the umpire when you could be the star player? And it's true, you miss that part of it, but being a judge has its rewards.
Interesting analogy. It's becoming, seems harder and harder for younger attorneys to get courtroom experience. It sounds like you were able to get quite a bit of courtroom experience.
So I am very mindful of that, and I have a special rule in my court to prefer young lawyers to argue. I have a special local rule on that. If I'm assured that they're going to send a young lawyer down, young meaning years of experience, not chronological age, I might not have set the matter for an oral argument, and I will, to give a lawyer an opportunity to argue and give the lawyers a basis to say to their clients, that crazy Judge Lynn really wants us to send a young lawyer when they might not otherwise, because there's so few opportunities today for in-courtroom experience that I do what I can to make sure they have those opportunities, and I've encouraged colleagues all over the United States to do the same.
And I was just going to ask you, that seems like a unique approach to managing the courtroom. Is that something that you're trying to have other judges do that?
Yes, I've gone out and lectured to other courts. I've encouraged my own court. Judges have their own ways of doing things, and they like to design their own techniques, and I understand that. But we really want to raise a generation up that are not partners who have never been in a courtroom, but they're partners in a trial section. That's not good. So we need to give those opportunities. And I try to be creative about what those opportunities are. And I'll let people split arguments so that more junior lawyers get a chance to argue.
That's great. I wonder which way that's going to shift with more online digital hearings.
Me too. Yeah. I've tried to pay attention to that. I haven't seen that shifting one way or the other. I think junior lawyers are probably behind the scenes schooling their seniors on how to do it. It must be true, like my law clerks are schooling me on how to do it. But I think eventually that's all going to even out. I don't think it's going to be more opportunities just because it's digital. But really, junior lawyers on cases I've had, because these opportunities are so scarce, they have been fantastic because they're so well prepared. Right. They treasure the chance to do it. And when clients see that and they recognize they're not getting billed extraordinarily for somebody ramping up when they don't have a lot of experience, if you can eliminate that, clients see how great someone is, the opportunities are going to be available to them.
Well, and it's really you looking back and reaching a hand out and lifting someone up. I think it's really important leadership to lead by example. And I feel like you've just modeled that so well by opening your wings, like wings were open for you whenever you joined Carrington with your mentors.
Yep. I mean, you got to pass it on to the next generation. I thought that was very important. That got passed on to me, and I'm doing my part. There are things said about people that pull up the ladder behind them. I don't think anybody's ever going to say that about me because I just won't let that happen. I had opportunities that I made myself, but I also had opportunities that other people made for me. I'm very grateful for that, and I'm going to share the wealth too.
It's a good example to have. I think it's important to see that you can do that and be successful, and we can. Ultimately, we're all on the same team.
Yeah, there's plenty of work to go around. I
Yes.
mean, you really have to be someone who reciprocates. I've always said to people who are thinking about business development, call people and then when you've got a matter to send, call those same people. I mean, you can't just expect people to give you work. You have to be willing to pass it on and make referrals to others and develop networks. That's how the world works. In every quadrant of the world, relationships matter. And so it sounds sort of forced and mechanical, but it wasn't this way. If I went to an event for the bar and I had a great conversation, if I had met one of you and we had a chat and I was impressed with you, I would have written you a personal note. Not email. A personal note written by my hand, because it makes a good impression. And maybe I don't hear from you for 3 years, But you remember me and I remember you. And Bob Blumenthal at my law firm used to say that developing business is like fishing. The more lines you have in the water, the more likely you are to catch a fish. And so that was something I found inspiring. You know, get out there in the world. It's not just all about mercantile business, but if you can have fun and get business too, hooray. I used to take people out, not to something that I didn't want to do, but to something I wanted to do. And then if it was a bust, at least I had done what I wanted to do.
You had fun.
Yeah, I had fun. So I always used to work business development into my life. And that was the way I was able to do so many things, because I tried to combine pieces of my life together and not say, okay, it's now 5 o'clock, now I have to give up being a lawyer, now I'm going to be a mom, and then at 10 o'clock I'm going to be a wife. I'm going to sort of mush these things all together as best I can.
The system obviously just got a shock to the system, as most of us did, from the pandemic, and things had to change. Were there adjustments that were made that you think will stay long term, or how will that change the judicial process going
So
forward?
I had my first jury trial in person in June of 2020. When I tell people that, they say, you don't mean in person, or you mean 2021. And I say, no, I mean in person, and I meant June of 2020. Because I felt like trials were going to happen, and so I wanted to try to conduct a trial as safely as possible, consistent with justice. And so I just thought about everything that could happen and how could we achieve a fair trial, as criminal case, and protect all of the participants, including the jurors, witnesses, lawyers, and parties. One thing that I think will survive is our use of technology. I hope a lot of that will survive. I think there's pretty much a consensus among the bar and the bench that we can do a lot of things more efficiently and economically through technology than in person. I mean, you know, you're in a large law firm. You might need to go to Milwaukee for a hearing in the middle of the winter that's going to take 20 minutes, and leave your family and spend the night in a hotel and fly both ways in the cold with bad weather that might delay you, and all the challenges that we lawyers know can happen. When you can do it very well, very conveniently, very economically, where the judge can see you and hear you well online. And that makes your practice more rewarding and easier and less stressful without the client losing a thing and saving a whole lot of money. So I think a lot of that can and should survive. I think our profession is not all that forward thinking and all that creative, really, when it comes to thinking how we can get rid of some of what has slowed us down and improve technologically. We need a little kick in the pants every now and then, and the pandemic really gave us that. So I think, you know, I've said to lawyers, one disappointment I've had is that I didn't think lawyers were as creative themselves about how to do things during the pandemic. As an example, I've been saying to large law firms, why haven't y'all gotten together and figured out a way to design a mask that has a microphone built into it? Because the number one thing I hear from jurors during the trial is we couldn't hear the lawyers. It's just too muffled. It's hard to talk through a mask. It's hard to breathe. You're not as persuasive. But you could design a good mask. Law firms could go in on that, and that could get the job done. I've proposed having trials outside in the park. I think a civil trial outside in the park could be of great public interest, and you wouldn't have the challenges associated with having people indoors during the middle of a pandemic. Years ago, the section of litigation, when I was the chair, we did trial demonstrations at the state fair under the tent. So we'd have cross-examinations and opening statements, and people loved it. They'd line up. You'd have an interesting case. It'd be like watching Perry Mason, except it would be real, or all the other law shows that we have now, and people loved it and showed up. So I'm all about getting people exposed to what we do. I think it's a great thing. So there's really nothing good you can say about the pandemic. It's set our country back in countless ways. But I think the use of technology for presentation and to make lawyers' lives easier, I think that hopefully will survive, and the profession will be better for it.
Yeah, the in-person is always that's the dynamic in a courtroom setting, right? Those feelings and emotions. Are there any standout moments that if you go back in your career and you're like, gosh, this case really it moved me, or it changed me, or?
Well, I don't have a particular case like that. I think what has really changed me as a person is my experience with criminal matters. I mean, I did very little of that when I was a lawyer, a little bit, but nothing like what I'm doing now. And you know, you tend to associate with people that have backgrounds similar to yours. And I, you know, came up in a white Jewish middle class background, living in Miami, Florida. And I see people every day who didn't lead a life remotely like mine. The challenges that they were presented with were just astronomical compared to the worst thing that ever happened to me. And that's made me a more empathetic person. It's caused me to try to be as encouraging as I can of people who have probably never had somebody give them a fair shake in their whole life. And to try to give people hope while doing justice. The challenge of sentencing people is the hardest thing I do, and will always be until the day I retire. And that's an awesome responsibility, to take away somebody's liberty and leave their children and their spouses behind. So administering justice in a criminal context is a complicated thing. It is not easy. There's a whole lot of factors that come to play, and I take that work really seriously, and that's left me with some sleepless nights. I mean, I've had maybe 5 cases over my career. One of them, I actually had to leave for a little while. It was so gut-wrenching what had happened in this person's life. And the crime was serious. And so there were victims of the crime. But some of the things that had happened to this person, and it's not always the case that they're female defendants, but often they are. You know, it just was overwhelming, the horror that had happened to this person's life that had turned them into the kind of person that could commit a very serious crime. So I don't want that to go away, because as hard as that is, I want to be reminded of that every time I'm taking that job on, that, you know, sending a person to prison is a very serious thing, and it's warranted in many, many cases, but I try my best to really understand what brought the person to that.
It's hard not to take some of that home with you, too.
Right.
And there's more to, I mean, there's just looking at your life and your schedule and your engagements, there's so much more to that. It's hard to imagine that something as life-changing and eye-opening as some of these experiences you've had on the bench wouldn't affect how engaged you are every day in your family and with your friends. How do you juggle all of these things, and what sustains you?
Well, you can't live the worst parts of your life all the time, and I don't want to give a wrong impression about this being the worst part of my life. I mean, it's an important responsibility. It's not that when it comes to sentencing day, I don't want to go to work. I mean, it's important, and I try very hard to do the right thing and work very hard at it. So I'm proud of the work I've done. But it's not the kind of thing I want to think about, you know, 24/7. And what relieves the tension of that is my friends and my family and my extracurricular activities. So I like nothing better if I have a really rough day that my husband and I are going out to a nice dinner, and I'll have a glass of wine, and that'll be that. I mean, I can't carry that along with me from week to week all the time. You just can't live that way. So, I mean, I try to have a very rich, expansive life that has its low points and its high points, and hopefully has more high points than low points.
Well, your network is so vast, because in the role that you're in, you touch a lot of lives, whether it's, you know, directly with plaintiffs and defendants, or indirectly through the lawyers and people that you mentor, and your friendships that you have. I'm just curious, if you were to, you certainly have a legacy, and you are a legend here in Dallas, but what do you feel your legacy is, and what do you want it to be?
I work very hard, and that I'm fair, and that I don't show a personal or political bias in the work that I do, and that I remain essentially an optimistic person. I think, you know, my life and my career have confirmed that most people are good, and that everybody deserves respect. I had very good counsel from my friend Nancy Atlas, who was a judge in the Southern District, to treat all defendants respectfully. And I've tried very hard to do that and have largely achieved that. The exceptions are when a person is just very disrespectful and unruly and you have to take action. I've had a couple of those. But people really appreciate it when they think you're listening to them, even if you send them to prison for a long time, that they got a fair hearing. So I'd like people to say that I worked hard and administered justice fairly. That would be my goal for my career.
Is there anything else like on the horizon? Are there any, I mean, there's so much that you've done. Are there any other mountains that you want to climb?
Well, I'm going to be the president of the American Inns of Court starting in July. Wonderful people have had that job before me. Carl Stewart, former Chief Judge of the Fifth Circuit. Most recently, the current president is Kent Jordan of the Third Circuit, and I'm really looking forward to taking that job because I saw Judge Stewart last night and he was saying this about the American Inns of Court. It has no agenda. It's just trying to achieve excellence, professionalism, and civility in our profession, and everybody ought to agree that those are wonderful goals. And we have a great relationship with justices in the UK and with lawyers in the UK and with lawyers and judges all over America. So that'll be a good, fun job that I'll look forward to. I'll have a 2-year term of that. And I'm planning to retire in the fall of 2025, and then who knows what I'll do then.
Enjoying those grandkids and
I'm going to do that all the time between now and then.
Well, maybe we'll see a memoir or an audio, you know, a book of your
If
life.
I write down all the stories I could tell, I'm really going to have a really good editor.
I'll volunteer. Yeah, we can have a tea party. Tell me all about
Sounds
it.
good.
Well, I'm so happy and that we've had a chance to sit down and talk with you and get to know a little bit more about you. It's been a pleasure and an honor. And I'm so thankful to have you as a mentor and as a leader in our community.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I echo everything Lisa said.
It's been a real treat for me. I sure appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.